Okay, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to Stage at Leeds. Welcome to the School of Performance and Cultural Industries, especially those of you that aren't based here and perhaps have not been in this building so often. So here is our lovely theatre space. My name is Jonathan Price. I'm an academic here in the school, and I've got the very pleasant and privileged duty today of introducing my colleague, Dr Alice Borchi. Okay, so what to say about Alice? Alice and I are actually precise contemporaries in PCI. We arrived here at the same time, about just over 5 years ago, and in fact we even each got our first promotions on the same day. So we've been going hand in hand through the process. I've talked with Alice, I've shivered on picket lines with Alice. I've engaged in conversations with Alice in research groups, and in fact that's the capacity that I'm here in this afternoon, because I'm the convener of the Centre for Cultural Policy and Leadership, which is one of the roster of research groups that we have in PCI, where we get together periodically to talk about the subjects that interest us and to try and advance our knowledge and support colleagues. And Alice is also part of the participation group that is one of those as well. So this is one of the things we're trying to do with these sessions, is to connect them with the active research in the school and make sure that's shared with audiences such as yourselves. Through those sessions and through that teaching and so on, I was thinking, how do I characterise Alice as a colleague? And of course there is kind of a thread of principle that runs through a lot of what Alice does. Alice might be Italian. She's not perhaps the most stereotypical demonstrative Italian. She's a calm and valued presence in the school, but there is a bit of quiet ferocity that I think sits underneath that quiet exterior, and there's a kind of principled intellectual curiosity, I think, that runs through Alice's work that I and many other colleagues value very highly. Alice is also, in terms of formal roles, the Director of Postgraduate Research Studies here at the school, and as well as being part of those research groups. So she's a very important member of the research community. But also she contributes significantly through her teaching and the ideas that she brings to that, and as part of that kind of thread of principle, I think, was behind the development of the Arts and Activism module, which many of us now teach on, and Alice was a big part of driving that forward. So it speaks to the kind of character of work that she brings into the school. Alice is modest about her own background. I was talking to her earlier and about other things that she's done in her career, which she dismisses as odd jobs. But Alice's idea of odd jobs are much more interesting than most of ours. She was a translator back in Italy for the artist Filippo Biagioli. She's worked in radio, she's done PR for a dance company. She was part of the evaluation team for Hull 2017 during the period when she was researching her PhD. She's been in the UK since 2011. We're very lucky to have her still here. She came across to Warwick to do her master's and then pursued her PhD there as well. And that PhD was on the idea of cultural commons, which she's going to be delving into with you this afternoon. Her PhD was specifically on culture and the economic crisis, looking at the situation in Italy after the previous financial crash. And the interest in cultural commons kind of was very much based on some ideas around activism coming through the Italian art scene at the time. And I won't give any more spoilers than that. It's part of some work that's leading towards a monograph which is titled Common in Culture. So look out for that at all good bookshops near you soon. Alice's just come back from research leave where she's been working on that. So she's brimful of ideas. We're really pleased to have so many of you here to listen to them this afternoon. So I commend to you my colleague, Alice Borchi.
Thank you so much, John, for the lovely introduction. And thank you so much, you all, for being here today. So today I'm going to talk about my research on the cultural commons. The reason why you see some very different words on these slides with things like sheep, software, wine, and theaters, it's because that these different elements and symbols are indicative of different stages in the study of the commons and the cultural commons more specifically. So the cultural commons as a disciplinary area is very wide. It is a very much interdisciplinary field. And as such, you can find work on the cultural commons across a very wide range of disciplines, from human geography, cultural policy, fine art, and also the digital sphere and the study of law. And the study of the cultural commons is directly connected to a series of fundamental questions around human behavior, creativity, and what is to be considered fair more broadly in the field of arts and culture. And also, how does that affect things like management and governance in the creative and cultural industries and in culture at large? We'll see that they're also related to some broader global concerns, not necessarily just arts and culture, and also they are connected to matters around what is cultural value, why do we value culture, and also what are the implications of that for cultural policy. So I'm going to start with how I think all good lectures on culture should start, talking about sheep. So why I'm talking about sheep? Because this is the first stop of our tour of the history of the study of the cultural commons, and we're starting with the environmental commons. And we're going to address issues around non-technical solution problems and human behavior. So we can say that the study of the commons had a major breakthrough with the paper The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin of 1968. To contextualize this, if we think about 1968, we can see a rapid growth in population, a rapid series of changes in technology, and at the same time, quite a strong anxiety connected to this momentous growth, especially in relation to global threats, such as the Cold War. It is in this context that Garrett Hardin discusses the problem of overpopulation and the problem of the overexploitation of resources. And according to Hardin, technology, all of the science that we have, cannot solve the problem of overpopulation, nor the problem of the overexploitation of resources. This is not something we can throw science at to solve. But rather, it is something that can only be addressed through policy, by addressing behavior and addressing that at the state level. As I promised, I'm going to talk about sheep. So in Hardin's example, he makes the example of the British commons of the Middle Ages. So those plots of land shared by the community, normally for purposes like foraging or grazing. And in Hardin's example, we can see a community of shepherds sharing a commons, a piece of land for grazing purposes. And Hardin argues that if all the shepherds start adding one animal to their herd, pursuing their own economic interest, of course, more sheep, more revenue, more milk, more animals to sell, these resources are soon going to be depleted. and because there's going not to be no more resources for the sheep to graze on. And this, according to Hardin, is something that is inevitable because human behavior is inherently individualistic and inherently pursuing economic rationality, analyzing costs and benefits from an individual perspective, and not take into account the interest of the whole community, the common good. So, according to Hardin, what is needed in this context is a state, an authority that is able to protect the common good and through an implementation of regulations. And as we can see, this can be considered as a non-technical solution problem. So this perspective on individual economic rationality is directly challenged by the work of Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009. And basically, Ostrom argues that the tragedy of the commons is not inevitable. She refers to a lot of field work that she's done across the world, studying different contexts in which communities are able to manage a shared resource, common pool natural resources, these are the words she uses, in a successful way. So commons on the basis, Ostrom on the basis of this analysis of the fieldwork is able to devise a theoretical framework for the study of shared systems of natural resources. So, according to Ostrom, there are a variety of factors that affect the way in which people are able to manage shared resources. And at the basis of that, there is the principle of collaboration, of course, the ability for people to come up independently with a shared system of regulations and rules that people agree on, and a shared system of governance. So Ostrom's work demonstrates that the way in which humans take decisions is not just on the basis of individual economic rationality, but rather it is based on a wide series of factors that are not just based on the individual pursuit of economic benefits. So in this first example, we can see that the debate of on the commons is not just about the idea of how people share a natural resource, for example, but is a bit more broader than that. Because at the core of this debate, there is the idea that the human behavior is something that is not just related to individual economic pursuits. It's beyond the idea of homo economicus. And connected to that, we can see some oppositional values. On the one hand, the idea of individualism. On the other hand, the importance of social relationships and how they dictate the way in which people are able to share resources together. On the one hand, we can see in Hardin's work the idea that it is impossible for a community of humans to come up with a series of shared rules and regulations without the intervention of a higher authority, whereas in Ostrom's work, we can see that these self-regulating communities exist. And eventually, the opposition between individual and community gain. I'll now move on to software that is mainly concerned with the idea of information and creativity. How do we go from sheep to software? Good question. So we start to see the term cultural commons being used in the context of information, the study of information and knowledge. There is a paper from 1978 by Goldner who discusses the relevance of the cultural commons in the context of rapid changes in relation to technology. So according to Goldner, culture, and culture here is to be understood as that wealth of artistic and scientific knowledge and all that kind of information that regulates our life more in general. Culture, according to Goldner, is something that humanity shares. Is at the basis of the cultural commons that humanity uses for their own creativity and for the advancement of new ideas. And this is an idea that will come back again and again in the history of the study of the cultural commons, that as humans, our ideas do not exist in a vacuum. They always refer to the work of people from the past, refers to ideas that have been made before, have been thought before. So Goldner's main argument is that the commons, the cultural commons, are becoming increasingly privatized and turned into capital. Culture is being capitalized through some specific mechanisms, one being specialized education, the other instead being intellectual property. By protecting culture through the means of intellectual property, the culture is being turned into capital, into a monetary asset that can be purchased and accessed only with an economic exchange. And as a result, according to Goldner, what happens is that we see the rise of a new class in around this time. That is a class that whose power does not rely on the means of production as much as it does on cultural capital. So this capitalization of culture that is taking place. What is the relevance of that? How is that connected to the broader context of the time? It is towards the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s that we can see a new attitude towards the idea of knowledge and its role in the economy, more in particular. In the postmodern condition by Lyotard, there is this main assumption that knowledge is a crucial, fundamental asset in the global economy. Knowledge is and will be produced in order to be sold, and it is and it will be consumed in order to be valorized in a new production. In both cases, the goal is exchange. So Lyotard identifies the exchange of knowledge as the main driving force for the future of the economy. And of course, this cannot happen without asking some questions. What happens when knowledge is commercialized? And what happens in particular when the knowledge production tries to happen outside the paradigm of capitalist production? And also considering the global implications of the technological advancement, especially of the time, but of course it's more and more relevant today, what is at stake in the commercialization of knowledge? And basically, who owns knowledge? And what are the consequences of something like that? So from the 70s onwards, intellectual property law has made some rapid advancements, becoming increasingly more and more protective of the work for the rights of authors. And we can see that with the creation of organizations such as the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, and also with the changes that have happened globally in intellectual property law and more noticeably in the US. So this is due, as we can imagine, to technological advancements. It's much, much easier now to share and distribute cultural works and cultural and intellectual property. It is, thanks to the internet, all this material is widely accessible. It is widely accessible to legal means, of course, but also to illegal means. It's very easy to find pirated works protected by copyright online. And however, of course, there is a very strong argument for copyright, as its aim is to protect the right of authors, and in particular in this context, the right of artists. However, one of the key points of criticisms of copyright is that it is focused on the interests of major companies with monopolistic interests. Yeah, so this, of course, has an impact on free speech, and it has an impact on creativity. And in particular, reference to free speech, I think that it's very interesting to see what happens online when some copyrighted work gets referenced or reproduced in certain contexts that are critical of said work. And very often, these critiques are removed from the internet on the basis of copyright law, although it falls into fair use. So copyright is sometimes being used as a weapon to suppress criticisms and free speech. And also when it comes to creativity, as we said, the creativity is not just about the creation of completely novel ideas, but it is also about the remix and the reutilization and the creative rework of already existing property. We are now talking about the importance of the public domain. And is the public domain like the environment? In the work of Boyle, and in particular in a very important paper called A Politics of Intellectual Property, Environmentalism for the Net, Boyle makes the argument that it is important to protect the public domain as it is important to protect the environment. So in this context, we're still talking about knowledge commons, cultural commons. This is still the terminology that is being used at the time to talk about matters related to the public domain. And Boyle argues that basically the public domain needs to be accessible and needs to be replenished and needs to still exist in a context that is dominated by increasingly protective copyright laws. Here we are talking about a context that is very wide, as we're talking about knowledge in general and information to be understood as pretty much everything from a Disney film to something like the human genome. So we're talking about a wealth of information here. And Boyle's main argument is that these increasingly protective copyright laws are made in the interest of big, major international companies and tend to be to the detriment of small actors, to those people who try to upkeep and to maintain the public domain. So thinking about people like librarians, scientists, and artists. So according to Boyle, being able to access a rich and fertile public domain that allows people to engage with a wide range of ideas and informations and artistic outputs, it's as important as protecting the environment, because it is crucial for the future of culture, information, and science to be able to share ideas and use them to create something new. So we can see the environmental metaphor still being very important even in relation to knowledge. And it is important that this comparison is still being upheld in the context of information, because it is essential here to see how the public domain is not being perceived as something that is just belongs to the past, but it's something that needs to be nourished continuously through the sharing intellectual works. One of the ways in which the copyright was challenged around the end of the 90s and towards the beginning of the 2000s was the idea of the copyleft. So this copyleft is an umbrella term that defines all those practices that are being created in order to provide a more flexible approach to authors' rights and to also, while still protecting the basic interests of artists and scientists. One of these practices was connected to the idea of the Creative Commons. which is a license that allows authors to decide to what extent they want the work to be accessible and reused and remixed by other authors. And it is very popular when it comes to information that is being shared online. And here, I think that this quote from Lessig, who was one of the main promoters of the Creative Commons license, is really interesting. As he says, the idea here is that we need to build a layer of reasonable copyright law by showing the world a layer of reasonable copyright law resting on top of the extremes. So according to Lessig, there are extremes, people who are completely against the idea of copyright, and instead people who want copyright to be as restrictive as possible. What Lessig was trying to achieve is a happy medium that allows for the distribution of creative work in a way that is more flexible and that is more adaptable for the context of online digital and the digital sphere. And this kind of work is being defined also as copyfight, besides copyleft, because according to some scholars, this kind of work does not sit outside copyright itself, but it is something that is designed in order to fight the extremes of copyright laws. So here, the term copyfight. And one of the people who argues for this is Anonymous. Anonymous is the one who defines the Creative Commons as copyfight and not copyleft. Here we have an example of copyfight left. And Nemo's provocation is really interesting because she says that if property is theft, as Proudhon famously argued, then intellectual property is fraud. Intellectual property is a meaningless concept. Ideas don't behave like land and cannot be possessed or alienated. Ideas are not original, they are built upon layers of knowledge accumulated throughout history. Out of these common layers, artists create works that have their unmistakable specificity and innovations. While creative works reassemble ideas, words and images from history and their contemporary context. So according to Nemos, the Creative Commons exist regardless of whether there is a law or a policy framework to protect them. The Creative Commons, the Cultural Commons, to be understood as the wealth of knowledge that has been accumulated throughout history, is still there for everybody to enjoy. So imposing something like copyright is basically like fraud. It's like putting a price on something that really is not for people to commercialize. So this is an interesting and quite extreme view. And I think that Lessig would have identified this as one of the extremes in the debate. So we're towards the end of this other movement, let's say, in the history of the study of the cultural commons. And here we can see we're still pretty much focused on the idea of the cultural commons as a matter of property. And in particular, the concern here is around knowledge, culture, and creativity. Who owns them? How is it possible to commercialize them? And with what kind of consequences? And there are some fundamental questions about how do the creative industries work? Because as everybody here who's ever studied the creative industries, we know that intellectual property is one of the main driving forces of the creative industries. But here the question is intellectual property in itself a form of tragedy of the commons? Or is it instead a mechanism that we need in order to protect the author's rights? And we have also an interesting question around relationships of power and fair use. Fair use is a term that comes up again and again when we talk about intellectual property. But what is fair when positions of power with major global corporations that own, basically, quite a lot of resources in the media landscape and in the cultural landscape, have such a way in the way in which intellectual property law is being defined. And what is the interest instead of those people who try to make ideas as widely accessible as possible? So this is a fundamental question that we find around this time related to the existence of the cultural commons. Raise your glasses, it's time to talk about wine in relation to communities and doing things together. So we move on towards the end of the 2000s, we start the 2010s more or less, and we can start to see that the debate on the cultural commons tries to move away from the idea of intellectual property. And we start with this conversation with a paper by Madison, Frischman, and Strandberg, who try to provide a definition of cultural commons that is not exclusively related to the idea of public domain. It is still quite wide as it encompasses scientific and artistic knowledge, but it tries to address these different systems of sharing knowledge and ideas. So in this definition by Madison, Frischman, and Strandberg, we find that the cultural commons being defined as environments for developing and distributing cultural and scientific knowledge through institutions that support pooling and sharing that knowledge in a managed way. What does that mean in practice? Well, according to Madison and his colleagues, there are a few examples that can be made here. One would be Wikipedia. Wikipedia is perhaps one of the most fitting examples for this. It is an environment where people come to share information with each other and managing that in a way that makes sense and ensures a degree of quality control about what is being published. And other examples are the Associated Press and the American Aircraft Manufacturer Association. So organizations that are about sharing professional knowledge and protecting also the interests of the people that work within that specific field. But also they see an example of cultural commons in fans who go to jam band concerts and record jam bands. And I think that the paper makes the example of people who go see Fish and the Grateful Dead, I think. Yeah, so, and they record these sessions and make them available within the fan community. However, we can see these, of course, very different examples here. Some of them might be directly related to ideas of intellectual property. Some others seem to exist outside of the system. This definition slightly changes over time. In the following year, they defined cultural commons as shorthand for situations in which the resources shared by members of a community are cultural resources. So just sharing resources. We don't see that much focus on the fact that they're managed, they're being shared in a managed way, or any other more specific indication of how this happened. So the new definition was being given in response to a counterpoint offered by another author, Solom, who responded to the paper with some interesting critiques and questions. The most important being, what makes a cultural commons a commons? Do all commons share an essential structure or functional construction? If not, what does account for the use of the term commons? And here we have perhaps one of the biggest issues when it comes to trying to come up with a definition of cultural commons that can suit the wide different interdisciplinary discourse that is around the cultural commons and tries to address culture by both considering matters of ownership, management, and governance, as we will see in a minute. One of the ways in which this issue of providing a definition for the idea of cultural commons comes from four Italian scholars, Santagata, Bertacchini, Bravo, and Marelli. So according to these authors, there are three main aspects to the cultural commons. The cultural commons are defined by culture, so a cultural resource, community, so a group of people that is able to manage them, a space. So it can be a digital space or a physical space, but a specific context for sharing and managing cultural resources. So they define them as a cultural resource shared by a group, which can generate one or more social dilemmas. It's very interesting to think about social dilemmas in the context of culture, because culture is not necessarily a rivalrous resource. We can all enjoy the same play at the same time. It's not like if somebody is enjoying one play, the rest of the audience can't. So there is a limit to how non-rivalrous that resource is. And at the same time, culture is not as perishable as some other physical resources. It can be enjoyed from time and time again. So we have a question here about what counts as a social dilemma. And it's interesting to think about that around matters of authenticity, who gets to engage with a certain kind of culture, for example, or around matters of heritage as well, making sure that a heritage resource can be enjoyable for the years to come, for future generations. So the main point of reference for the Santagata and his colleagues are the cultural districts. And perhaps this is one of the easiest ways to think about that. Because in a cultural district, we have resources, of course, physical resources, such as buildings and other materials that people can share, but also, most importantly, knowledge resources. So assets that people can share with each other in order to generate innovation. And we can think about these as a form of open innovation, if you will. So people who can exchange information across different organizations in order to advance creativity and innovation. And so of course, it's very easy to imagine that in the context of the urban cultural districts, but we can also think about cultural districts that are not located within cities. One of the examples that is being made in the book by Bertacchini, Santagata, Bravo, and Marelli is about the Lake District. As a natural environment, it was massively important for authors and for the different literary figures to share ideas and to generate a lively cultural environment. However, we don't just have cultural districts in these examples. We also have something like the production of Barolo wine. The production of Barolo wine because it is, again, directly connected to a specific cultural context, a specific space in which the cultural resources, in this case, the knowledge that is required in order to produce this kind of wine, is being shared. And of course, this happens within a specific community. And as a result, we can understand that this definition can be quite broad. Another example that is being made is about the networks that existed between the different members of the Italian futurist movement. Again, we're thinking about intangible cultural resources being shared by a group. And in this case, we can see a social dilemma as the contribution of people is fundamental in order to make that movement alive or to make it irrelevant. So again, we can see different kinds of social dilemmas, and also the cheese rolling competition that happens in Gloucestershire. It's another example of cultural commons. As again, it is a tradition that is being shared in a community of people, and there is a social dilemma because there's just so many people can do that. Otherwise, it's really dangerous. So we can see that, again, all these examples tend to be quite far apart from the ideas around information and intellectual property that belonged to the study of the cultural commons of the late 90s and also the early 2000s, but instead there is a focus on communities of people sharing cultural resources in a determined context and with specific social dilemmas to address. And this is one of the key aspects here, and perhaps one of the key challenges that we come back from this particular time in the study of the cultural commons is related to issues around the definitions. Because of course, in the definition offered by Santagata, Marelli, Bravo, and Bertacchini, there is an indication of the key factors that determine the cultural commons. So we have an answer for the question that Solon was asking: what are the key characteristics of a cultural commons? How do we define a cultural commons? However, we still are not engaging with ideas that necessarily belong to the legal sphere of the commons. So matters related to property, management, and policy. That is something that I'm going to address in the next section on theatres. In the years that followed the early 2010s, the study of the cultural commons started to flourish and started to encompass a wide range of different cultural resources. So including the digital sphere, the urban sphere in particular is extremely important, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. Artistic forms of collaborations based around the idea of the cultural commons, political cultural commons, so those forms of sharing cultural resources and co-creating culture that are directly tied to political organization and political organizing. And interestingly, another idea that is related to the cultural commons is the one of landscape. In the work of Salvatore Settis in particular. It's really interesting to think about landscape because it seems to bring together, the very beginning of our conversation around the commons, so natural resources, with cultural man-made resources. The different elements of landscape are both man-made and natural, and it is in landscape that we can see a reflection of the values and ideas of a community and how they address the preservation of a particular heritage of landscape to be handed over to future generations. And so landscape is also an interesting part of the cultural commons. It is in the urban context that we start to see a lot of attention being given to forms of co-production around commoning and culture. So in this context, we can see that now, since the early 2010s, cities try to experiment with co-production and co-production in urban spaces and making space for citizens to come together and engage with culture and co-produce it. It is particularly relevant as it is something that it is, of course, a form of participatory artistic production, but in some instances it became something a little more radical, as it tries to create organizations that are not just led by artists, for example, but also by communities that engage with the broader population in order to determine the future of the activities. This is usually achieved through the means of general assemblies and also through the means of specific subcommittees of people from the local community that work together in order to have a democratic engagement with the direction of the organization. And again, this tends to happen in buildings that are not necessarily owned by a group of people or co-owned, but sometimes this happens in buildings that are managed by the state, and this form of management is being used as a way to experiment with commoning in forms that is not directly linked to the idea of property. And when it comes to the relationship that these organizations have with the local government, it tends to vary quite significantly. We can see local governments being very invested in fostering this kind of space, but also we can see an antagonistic relationship with the local governments and with the people who engage in these practices, as it is in the case of spaces that were started as occupations, occupied buildings as a form of protest, that eventually became managed by the activists in order to co-create for different kind of cultural governance and cultural management. So, yeah, I have to talk about anti-capitalism, because a lot of the work of these organizations that tends to be aligned with values of anti-capitalism. And this is also why very often they tend to present themselves as antagonistic or hostile towards the key ideas of state management, and more broadly, a kind of hostility towards the key principles of the traditional way of understanding the creative industries, so with hierarchical structures or a strong focus on economic exploitation. So a lot of the key ideas around the commoning and anti-capitalism can be traced back to a wealth of different authors, Hart and Negri, for example. And here I would like also to refer to the work of Caffentzis and Federici. And just to give you some context, this also comes from the work I have done around the study of different forms of cultural organization and production that was born after the economic crisis of 2007 and 2008, and the need and the desire to think about creative production in a way that could break with the neoliberal sphere. And so, according to Caffentzis and Federici, the key idea is that the commons are not given. They're not something that the state gives to a group of people to manage, but actually the commons are co-produced. Their existence is directly related to the relationality of the people engaging with the commons. And culture in particular, in order to create a commons, needs to be co-produced. It needs to be based on collaboration. And in order for this to be achievable, there needs to be equal access to the means of production and equal access to governance. This means that all the people being involved in a cultural commons need to have the same kind of rights, not only when it comes to artistic production, but also in relation to governance and the direction of an organization, for example. And it is interesting to think that the anti-capitalism of the commons is directly related to the physical, materialistic aspect of the commons. Caffentzis and Federici stress that the commons are essential to people's livelihoods. They're not something nice to have, they're not a nice hobby, but it is directly, the commons are a way for people to engage with work that makes their life sustainable. And so we're not just talking about creative practices outside of labor, but embedded with labor. And also, Mandalaki and Fotaki make an argument about the embodied ethics of the commons. When it comes to understanding the relationality within the commons, Mandalaki and Fotaki do not so much focus on wider theory of ethics, but they focus instead on the physical presence of bodies in the same space and how this kind of relationality is built through physical, embodied presence, taking care of each other and making sure that people have equal access to everything they need within this context. It is about people coming together physically and is a matter of physical care, not just theoretical or virtual. It is tempting to see then the commons as a way to move beyond creative production, beyond neoliberal centers of power. We can see that the commons have this potential for bringing together different aspects of cultural production and cultural management, giving people equal access to production, management, governance, and use, but most importantly, care. This kind of model blurs the boundaries between management, audience, cultural producers, and artists. This is the aim, basically, of the cultural commons, to create a system of knowledge production and cultural production that is open and fluid and does not rely on specific predetermined categories within the organization, but that allows for a real co-produced approach to cultural governance and to cultural production. So this is why so many organizations that were looking for an alternative to traditional understandings of cultural productions directly connected to economic values were drawn towards this kind of approach. And we pretty much go back to the key ideas around human behavior and human nature that we were just discussing at the beginning when I was talking about sheep, when I was talking about Harding's idea of individualistic economic purposes as opposed to that relational approach that was proposed by Ostrom, because this is still something that is still at the core on the debate of cultural production. So what does it mean in practice when it comes to cultural policy? Well, again, going back to Elinor Ostrom devised a system of a list of different principles that were necessary in order for our commons to thrive. Among these principles, beside our system of shared rules and a way to enforce those rules, so on and so forth, we also find a fundamental principle, which is about the fact that the right to self-determination of the communities that are at the basis of the commons need to be recognized by higher authorities. So despite the commons trying to exist in a dimension that is beyond the private sphere and the public sphere, still need to engage with pretty much both in order to be sustainable and be able to do that work, basically. So it is legitimate to ask the question, what is the relationship between the common and the state? If Ostrom said that the state does not need to intervene in this context. And what are the different policy approaches that have been taken on this matter? So I have a couple of postcards here. One being a quick overview of how this policy matter has been debated and addressed in the Italian context, and the other one in France. So in Italy, the cultural commons were born out that series of occupations that took place between 2011 and 2014 as a way to protest against the economic crisis and the consequences that had in cultural policy when it came to mass cuts for funding to the arts. So, as you can imagine, this is a kind of oppositional relationship with the state, as these forms of commoning were born out of the desire to express dissatisfaction against cultural policy and the state. So we can see a different range of cultural buildings being occupied, and theaters, cinemas, and the like. And many of them were evacuated with the use of the police by the state. And as such, the right for self-determination was not being recognized by the state. However, very interestingly, a lot of regulations and frameworks were designed by local authorities. And one of the most famous is the one of 2014 in Bologna that was then imitated by a number of other cities. And that allows for the recognition of the rights of people who want to manage and share resources in the urban context, and more specifically around culture. And one of the most interesting examples of these local frameworks for the recognition of the cultural commons comes from the Neapolitan context, where one of these organizations that was born out an occupation of a cultural building, of a cultural organization, l'Asilo, managed to create a relationship of mutual trust with the local government in the city, with the local authorities, and started a collaboration for the co-design of a framework that not only allowed for the legal recognition of the organization, but also set the blueprint for the recognition of other similar organizations. And this kind of co-production of policy is a really interesting model in this context. So instead, what happened in France, and this is broadly based around the work of two people I'm collaborating, Martina Macou and Maud Pellissier. Here, the state seemed to be much more invested in the idea of the commons, with the formation of a third-place public interest group that on the commons that is connected in particular to the idea of third place, that comes from the concept of a space where people go for informal socialization outside of the work environment and the home environment. This public interest group is mainly focused with the promotion of spaces where people can come together informally and co-create and engage a series of activities. And this particular public interest group has been particularly concerned with the idea of commoning in this context. And also in France, we can see the creation of the first commons camp in Marseille around and that was created by the National Coordination of Intermediate and Independent Places. So all those organizations that are independent and not directly linked to the state. And in this context, we can see an interesting debate. On the one hand, the commons being a concept that is of interest to the state, and where the state has manifested the idea of supporting the creation of environments that include commoning practices. And on the other hand, a much more militant environment that is much more connected to the idea of the anti-capitalism, of the cultural commons, and on the inherent and antagonistic essence of the commons in relation to the state. And these two forces are very important for the debate on the cultural commons in France. So here we can see that the concept of cultural commons was fundamental in driving co-participatory approaches to cultural production, governance and policy making, and also to cultural management. So we can see this, again, this idea being getting more and more divorced from the idea of property, and instead being understood as a series of practices. Rather than a physical resource, a commons, what matters is the system of relationships that is at the basis of these practices, so forms of commoning. And beyond that, there is also a fundamental question that is based on the relationship between the commons and the state. So, as pointed out by Ostrom, there is that need to, for the higher authorities to recognize the rights of commoners. But what does that say on the nature of the commons? Are the cultural commons something that is inherently against the state, something that is inherently perhaps anti-capitalistic, and something that exists in the context of militant political culture, or is it something else? Are we talking about very politicized and forms of cultural activities, or are we talking about Barolo wine? The two things are quite different from each other. Quite interestingly, though, something that has been pointed out in an analysis of the kind of local frameworks for the recognition of the commons in Italy is that the kind of commoning and the cultural commons do not address necessarily matters of inequality in culture and the arts, because this kind of framework sometimes replicates exactly the same issues that we find in cultural participation in more traditional contexts. So with the marginalization of specific groups, and only with some people with a certain kind of background being able to contribute to the cultural commons as opposed to others. So the cultural commons are not necessarily a way to address inequalities, despite the claim for its antagonistic and revolutionary nature. So, in conclusion, the study of the cultural commons is an interesting way to think about how the idea of culture and how its value is perceived and understood throughout recent history speaks to us about global concerns and how those have changed throughout time. Of course, we find some of these concerns pretty much being very much still present nowadays. I think that our concern with how finite our resources are even more important, perhaps, and more prominent nowadays compared to the 60s. And undoubtedly, our conversations around who owns the internet, pretty much, who owns all these platforms where we share creativity, ideas, information, etc., is again a very important matter when it comes to the debate on culture and cultural production. It is also quite fit to have this kind of reflection in a university, where matters around and discussions around open access and the accessibility of the university, not only for students and members of staff, but its civic value to the broader community is often being called into question. So how do we transform the university into something that is a bit more of a commons, not only for the university community, but beyond that? I think it's an interesting question. And also, this kind of study asks us to rethink about cultural production, how it works, who owns power in this context, and why do we value culture more in general. And something that I want to stress is that this discussion is not meant to propose an easy solution to all ailments of creativity and cultural policy. It is not. The creation and maintenance of a cultural commons require a lot of time, a lot of commitment, and also a lot of energies. And sometimes it is very hard to make those that kind of work that goes into the upkeep of a cultural commons visible and properly recognized. And also, the cultural commons are not this universal panacea to solve inequality within culture and the arts, but actually we need to be reflective and critical about who gets to participate in a cultural commons, who gets to engage in this process of sharing, governance, co-production, use and care, and why. So this is everything from me, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Alice. That was absolutely fascinating. You've walked us through a really complex landscape of the cultural commons and intellectual history over time. starting with some of those texts from the 1970s and bringing that fully up to date. And I think it's one of those topics that's both really kind of philosophically fascinating, and you can philosophize around these issues for ages, but actually you've also shown us why it's really important and practical and connected with legislation and connected with people's livelihoods. So these are really fundamental things for us to discuss when we're looking into culture. I'm sure there are questions forming in all of your minds. I can see a couple of hands going up already, so I'll get to those while Alice also gathers her thoughts. One up there, was there, I think? Yes, and then you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. And I'd like to start with a point that you touched on at the end, actually, about open access. You know, as academics now, we are able to disseminate our research, you know, fairly easily, you know, openly and for free, yet we're still at the mercy of large commercial publishing houses. So I'm interested in your opinion of what you think is preventing that wider rollout of open research, and what the university or universities can do about it.
Yeah, if I have to think about that, to me, it's not just a matter of how we disseminate knowledge and how we disseminate information. I think that the issue comes with the role of university within the wider society. And I think that is a matter of inviting, you know, the people who are not already inside of the university in, and make the resources we have accessible to wider groups and not only to the university community, in my opinion, in order to fulfill that duty that we have in towards society. And I think that this is pretty much the main issue. Recreating a different kind of relationship between the university as an institution and the rest of the world, pretty much, and the rest of society, because I think that it's not just a matter of engagement with what is being produced from within the university that is the matter, is how people perceive the university as a potential center of power, as a potential creator of specific narratives as opposed to others, and the like. So to me, it's about a matter of openness that is not just about open access, is about the role of the university itself. And I don't think there is an easy solution to that, but I think it's a very important one, considering the environment that we live in, where there is you know, quite a distrust towards experts, towards scientific knowledge and the like. And I think that this is also connected to the role of universities in the societal context that needs to be readdressed, in my opinion. Again, not something easy, but something that I think is pertinent.
There's a question over here.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very interesting, everything you said. And I was going to ask something in line with what the previous person asked regarding the universities. Are we really the massive elephant in the room? I mean, we are major knowledge producers. And what you said about production of knowledge is very much spot on. I think it has to be co-production of knowledge. You know, it's not just about sharing, it's about how we plan, develop our relationships with the community to produce all that knowledge, whatever we want to call that knowledge, whether it is education or research outputs. Do we have like a moral obligation as practitioners, as educators, to foster or at least facilitate co-production of knowledge by our own students in collaboration with the community? Do we really have to understand our own academic culture and the internal barriers? Because there is nothing legal or professional stopping us from taking these open practices within our education, you know. But why don't we do it? Is it because people don't know? Is it because we are more conservative than we think we are?
I think the first answer to that comes to my mind is that it's hard. It's really hard to build a relationship of trust that can enable fair co-production within the education context and bringing those experts outside of the university in and making their work fairly acknowledged and not just being used as a means to enrich our education experience, for example. And we can think of, for example, of sometimes how long it takes to pay an external speaker or just to get an organization involved. So I think it's something that requires a level of agility on the institutional side and also a serious commitment on the educator side. So yes, it's hard. It can be achieved. And I have some colleagues here that are quite renowned for doing that in a very successful way too. And I think when it comes to the broader barriers, for sure there is a more of a conservative approach perhaps when it comes to education and the university. There are also barriers that might be of practical nature. Sometimes when asking for funding for research, the outcomes that we promise need to be specific in a certain way, or the kind of collaborators that we are envisaging to collaborate with need to be identified at a very early stage. So in a way that is not always conducive to have, an invitation to people for joining in and bring their own agendas into the research when it comes to obtaining research funding. And I see that as another issue. And on another end, connected to that is, again, the acknowledgement of people's expertise and making sure that we give back as much as we get from these co-production of knowledge practices that is not always easy to define or to put into practice. So this would be my initial understanding of this. And again, it's something that can be achieved for sure, and I have many successful examples of colleagues within PCI doing that. But it is something that very often people have to face numerous barriers before achieving. Thank you.
Question at the back.
Thanks, Alice, for a wonderful, wonderful talk. I wonder if you could say something a little bit about the project, how eclectic it is. One thing that's really struck me this evening is how you've kind of blown apart the notion of commons for me. I certainly had never thought about landscape from the perspective of commons. Will your book have that level of breadth to it, or do you zoom right in on the policy landscape?
Unfortunately, it will have to deal with quite a lot of the different elements I've spoken about today. It's going to have an interdisciplinary approach. And I hope to consider to basically have a taxonomy of the different kinds of cultural commons, including, for example, landscape. So yes, unfortunately, my answer is
unfortunate.
Yes.
It's a lot of work.
Maybe for you, but not for us.
It's a lot of work, that's the unfortunate bit. Ava.
Your work reference examples from Italy and from France and then some things from the UK. I'm really interested in that international element of the application of this idea. So could you speak a little bit more about the different kind of national examples, and have you looked at any other countries, and what's the most striking differences between those national attitudes towards the idea of a cultural commons?
So from the cases I have studied, I have mostly focused on Europe, and because that is where those alternative practices started to emerge a bit more prominently after the economic crisis. And I have to say that the level of engagement of policy has been very varied. I think just with the examples of Italy and France, on the one hand, we find an interest from the state into the commons as a concept, as making it replicable and applying that to a wide range of different fields of production. With my French colleagues, they were telling me that there are commons for the agricultural production, commons for manufacturing, etc., that have been taken into consideration within the French context at the state level, as opposed to the more local policy frameworks envisaged by Italian communities. It's a similar situation in Spain, I would say, where there are some particularly prominent examples as Barcelona en Comú and all that activities around co-production in the field of governance, in particular in the context of Barcelona and practices related to that. All around Europe, there are quite a wide range of spaces that engage with forms of co-governance, co-decision-making with the local population. They do not always use the term cultural commons. And in Southern America, there is a very strong history of democratic engagement in culture and in devising practices that are around the co-production of culture and most importantly in democratic approaches to cultural governance. And again, in some instances, the term commons is there, in some instances is not, but they're closely aligned to some of the principles of commoning. So I think it's a very wide, internationally, there's quite a lot of examples that do not always use the word commons necessarily, which makes things harder when it comes to definitions, of course.
I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Yes, one here.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I just wanted to ask, because a lot of the sort of dialogue in sort of climate discourse and climate crisis discourse points a lot to these kind of solutions in order to how we can move on in terms of governance and also managing crisis situations. I was wondering what you thought on terms of like viability and practicality and also like desire for these kind of things. Do you think it is viable? Can we move to these kinds of means of production or means of like working together or agricultural produce, all that kind of thing? I don't know how I can't necessarily like frame this question, but do you get what I'm trying?
Yeah, I understand what you mean, and I think the short answer to that is yes, but it's hard. So, because we're talking about a system that is quite complex and a system that requires continuous effort from a large number of people and that needs to be sustainable on the long time. Doing so without resources, as it often happens with these kind of organizations, and without acknowledgement from the government, and in particular I'm referring to public funding, can be really daunting. And when it comes to trying to come up with forms of governance that are not just based on voting, for example, of traditional forms of democracy that we encounter in our political life, but a bit more around the idea of consensus, coming to a shared agreement together, or including dissenting voices and things like that. Of course, this is a much more time-consuming kind of practice and a much more labor-intensive kind of practice. So in order for this to be sustainable, there needs to be a strong relationship with the people you are engaging with within the community that the organization is located within, and also a minimum of dialogue with higher authorities in order to be shut down from one day to the other. So my answer would be yes, but it's hard.
You mentioned, Alice, that it's the problem of trying to do this without resources, but actually it's people trying to approach solutions when they don't have resources that's generative of this kind of model, I guess. Exactly.
That's the main issue of trying to devise solutions that address directly that lack of resources through an alternative way of thinking about production and thinking about collaboration rather than a competition very often. So this was the case for the organizations I mentioned, that they were able to, very often in the creative industries and cultural policy, a good question is, where is the money coming from? And it's a very legitimate question. And in these cases, through campaigns of crowdfunding, through forms of basically open ticketing pricing policies with pay-as-you-can models, they were able to gain some economic resources in order to deliver the activities. And of course, though, this requires quite a lot of effort. And it can be quite complicated if you don't have legal infrastructure that protects you, this context.
It's the peril of appropriation and co-option.
Exactly, exactly.
Any other burning questions, or is it time to adjourn for refreshments? Leila, go ahead.
I mean, I guess I wanted to follow on from that a bit and go back to what you were saying at the end of the risk of these practices in replicating and reinforcing inequality. And even in that example you were just talking about, of course, there is the danger that the people who have the high cultural capital you talked about can most easily organise these kind of initiatives in the areas where people have the money to pay for the ticket prices that you just talked about. They can be more sustainable as models. So I guess I want to ask a question of whether you think these practices can address inequality in an unequal world. And I guess I relate that to Ava's question about the different models in different countries. That in England we have seen the move towards more asset transfers to the community, more participatory governance. But what we see time and time again is that they are successful in wealthy areas and they fail in poor areas, and they reinforce the inequality you addressed. So I just wondered if you could kind of say something about that.
This is directly connected to an analysis made by Yolanda Bianchi on the different kinds of local policies existing in Italy for the safeguard of the commons. And what she found was that these frameworks are not connected to any form of compensation for the labor that the commoners put into the commoning practices. And in the context of these practices, very often we're talking about upkeeping of heritage resources, for example, heritage assets. And what this means is that the people who are able to contribute are people who have the time to do so, and also are not restrained from by economic barriers, who do not need to be in work, basically, in order and can contribute with the spare time to these practices. So what happens is that it is not just about understanding this as a form of a different word for voluntarism, but it is about understanding this as an alternative form of labor that is compensated and it is equally distributed, and where resources, also economic resources, can be redistributed. So I think that until now, policy has not addressed the form of commoning as a form of labor, which is one of the main challenges, and hence why it is so easy for inequalities to be replicated in this field. So if you go back to Francis and Federici and the idea that the commons are directly connected to our livelihoods, this implies that commoning can be seen as an alternative form of survival and alternative form of work, basically. And this is the main challenge, I think, if policy does not address that, but just treats that as a nice thing to have.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you for the questions. I think it is time for us to wrap it up now and adjourn next door. I'm sure there's thousands of more lines of questioning, inquiry and thoughts going on, because that was an incredibly rich and thought-provoking talk, Alice. It's great to get insight into your research as well, and I'm sure we're all keen to see the book when it comes out, and then we can get further into those questions. So please do join us for a drink next door, but first of all, thank you to Alice.